You are standing at a checkout counter in 2026. You stare down at a receipt that feels like a quiet, calculated betrayal. You did the math. You rigorously checked your accounts. You played by the rules. Yet, the numbers simply do not add up to the lifestyle you were promised. You feel a phantom weight in your pockets. It is the visceral sensation of your hard-earned value, evaporating while you sleep. Stolen by forces you cannot see. Routed through mechanisms you were never meant to understand. You are experiencing the crushing reality of dilution, the silent killer of purchasing power. A slow-motion heist. The thief does not bother to take your money. He simply manufactures so much more of his own until yours ceases to matter. This is not a modern glitch in the economic matrix. It is not a byproduct of some recent policy failure. It is a grift as old as the Republic itself. Perfected in a freezing midwinter fog in 1868 by a man who looked less like a titan of industry and more like a rural undertaker. His name was Jay Gould. His target was the most dangerous financial predator in America. In the late 1860s, the Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt, was the undisputed, cutthroat king of the iron rails. At 74 years old, he commanded a personal fortune of roughly $100 million. That sum was so astronomically vast, it eclipsed the entire cash reserve of the United States Treasury. Vanderbilt did not just want wealth. He wanted total, inescapable supremacy. He already controlled the New York Central, dictating the terms of trade across the eastern seaboard. But one vital, chaotic artery remained entirely outside his grip: the Erie Railroad. In the smoke-filled gambling dens of Lower Manhattan, the Erie was notoriously known as the Scarlet Woman of Wall Street. She was a sprawling 400-mile stretch of track, connecting the wealth of New York to the raw potential of the Great Lakes. She was famously corrupt, perpetually leveraged to the hilt, spectacularly mismanaged by a syndicate of grifters. To Vanderbilt, she was the final piece of a continental puzzle. If he owned the Erie, he owned the definitive gates to the American West. He could unilaterally set prices, dictate the flow of essential goods, and squeeze every farmer, merchant, and factory owner from Manhattan all the way to Chicago. Vanderbilt had one strategy: buy everything. It was a hostile takeover of absolute, unvarnished brute force. He would march onto the trading floor and buy every single share of Erie stock until the market bled dry and surrendered. He was a man of the old world, a ruthless titan who believed down to his marrow, with enough gold, you could literally buy the earth. He launched his assault in early 1868. He poured millions in hard, physical capital into the market, driving the price of Erie stock from $68 to a staggering $95 a share. But as Vanderbilt's brokers frantically swallowed every paper certificate that hit the pit, a phantom anomaly emerged. the supply never dwindled. No matter how many shares the Commodore devoured, fresh paper flooded the floor the very next morning. It was a liquidity trap of nightmarish proportions. Vanderbilt was trying to empty the ocean with a silver bucket, while a hidden pipe pumped the water right back in. Across town, hidden away in a dimly lit cellar, Jay Gould sat with his flamboyant partner, Jubilee Jim Fisk. They were not old-world titans building physical empires. They were financial hackers. While Vanderbilt played by the rigid, predictable rules of the Gilded Age, Gould was writing the beta code for the Silicon Age. He understood a terrifying, foundational truth. A share of stock is not a piece of a company. It is just a piece of paper. And paper can be printed. Vanderbilt was hungry for a monopoly, but Gould was starving for survival. To Gould, the Erie Railroad was not a transportation network moving freight and human lives. It was a printing press with a locomotive attached. He realized that if he could manufacture fiat equity faster than Vanderbilt could buy it, he could pick the Commodore's pockets until the richest man on earth was left standing in his shirt sleeves. We are about to open the classified ledger on the Erie War and expose the shadow behind the success. To understand exactly how Jay Gould broke the wealthiest man in America, you have to dissect the precise architecture of his trap. In the mid-19th century, the American financial markets were a lawless frontier without a sheriff. The rules of engagement were written in pencil, and Gould carried a very large eraser. The mechanism he weaponized is a concept you have likely heard, but never felt the true, devastating weight of. Stock watering. The term originated in a literal dirt floor cattle trading scam. A grifter farmer fed his cows heavy salt to make them desperately thirsty. He would then let them bloat themselves on water right before hitting the commercial scale at the market. You paid premium prices for beef, but you were actually buying water. Gould executed this exact grift on the Erie Railroad, but instead of water, he used wet ink. His weapon of mass financial destruction was the convertible bond. On March 7, 1868, the Erie Board of Directors, a shadow syndicate controlled entirely by Gould, Jim Fisk, and their mentor Daniel Drew, voted to issue $10 million in corporate bonds. The officially stated purpose was to fund necessary equipment and iron improvements for the deteriorating railroad. Under the New York State General Railroad Act of 1850, this maneuver was entirely, undeniably legal. But Gould had engineered a backdoor in the fine print. These specific bonds carried a lethal conversion clause. At any given moment, the holder of that debt could swap it for pristine, newly minted shares of Erie stock. Gould did not invent the convertible bond. He turned it into a loaded gun. He issued the debt directly to himself and his cronies, bypassing any semblance of shareholder approval. They did not pay with cash. They borrowed the value against the company's own fractured credit. It was a masterclass in legal alchemy that turned company debt into personal ammunition. Up on the sunlit, frenetic trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange, Vanderbilt's brokers were screaming orders like artillery fire. Buy everything. Any price. Take no prisoners. They believed they were setting an inescapable trap, executing a classic short squeeze to force Gould to buy back shares at a ruinous, bankrupting price. What Vanderbilt did not realize was that Gould had rewritten the rulebook overnight. 50 feet below the manicured streets, in a damp, windowless cellar smelling of grease and solvent, Jay Gould was not trading. He was cranking. With every rhythmic, deafening thud of the heavy iron printing press, he minted another batch of convertible bonds. He immediately laundered those bonds into fresh, wet shares of Erie equity. On March 10th, the trap snapped shut. A tidal wave of phantom stock hit the market floor. 50,000 shares materialized out of thin air. Then another 50,000. Vanderbilt's men, blindly acting on their standing orders, swallowed the bait whole. They poured $7 million of Vanderbilt's personal gold, roughly $150 million in today's purchasing power, representing a staggering percentage of the total U.S. money supply, directly into Gould's pockets. Vanderbilt was no longer buying a railroad. He was buying paper manufactured in real time. By the time the Commodore realized he was drowning in a sea of diluted fiat equity, the damage was completely irreversible. He held the wet ink, and Gould held the hard cash. Vanderbilt had become the wealthiest bag holder in American history. The forensic reality is buried deep in the ledger of the Erie Railroad for the spring of 1868. The company's outstanding stock nearly doubled in a matter of weeks. Meanwhile, the actual physical assets, the rusting tracks, the aging locomotives, and the rotting timber, remained entirely static. The value of every single existing share, including those Vanderbilt hoarded, was effectively slashed in half. Gould was actively cooking the books in broad daylight, and the market applauded him for it. When Vanderbilt realized he had been ruthlessly played, he deployed the ultimate weapon of the elite. He bought a judge. He secured a severe injunction from Justice George Barnard of the New York Supreme Court, ordering the immediate arrest of Gould, Fisk, and Drew for the illegal issuance of stock. What followed was one of the most audacious exit scams in corporate history. On the freezing night of March 11, under the cover of a thick, blinding fog, Gould and his syndicate did not surrender to the authorities. They violently packed the corporate ledgers, the heavy printing press, and $7 million in untraceable greenbacks into leather satchels. They fled across the Hudson River in a small rowboat. They established a heavily fortified government in exile at the Taylor Hotel in Jersey City, which Fisk cheekily rebranded as Fort Erie. They hired a private army of 40 armed guards, aimed 3 small cannons directly at the New York skyline, and waited out the storm. Vanderbilt paced his Manhattan mansion, believing he had won the war by purchasing a judge. But Gould understood a much darker, systemic truth about American power. why buy the referee when you can buy the men who write the rules? Committing the ultimate act of regulatory arbitrage, Gould packed $500,000 in cold cash into a single valise and boarded a northbound train to Albany. The historical record from the New York State Senate in April 1868 is brutally clinical. Eyewitness accounts describe Gould openly walking the marble halls of the Capitol, casually handing out bribes of up to $5,000 per senator. The hallway outside the chamber smelled of cheap cigar smoke and wet wool. Each meeting lasted less than 5 minutes. The deal was simple. Vote yes, and the stock watering becomes perfectly legal tomorrow. One senator brazenly accepted cash from Vanderbilt to keep the stock illegal, and then took more from Gould to make it legal. He sided with Gould simply because the physical cash was more frequent and far more portable. Gould won. The Erie Bill passed into law. The state of New York legally declared that corporate dilution was a private business strategy, not a crime. Vanderbilt was forced into a humiliating settlement, recovering only a fraction of his fortune. He had been comprehensively beaten by a man who proved that in the realm of high finance, the truth is, whatever you have the liquidity to print. The toxic smoke finally cleared on the Erie War in the waning months of 1868. But the air in lower Manhattan carried the permanent, acrid stench of burnt reputations. Vanderbilt, the absolute monarch who believed his checkbook could buy the world, walked away with a $4.5 million settlement. It was nothing more than a peace treaty, signed in the blood of his own ego. He survived, but the myth of the Commodore's invincibility was permanently shattered. He had been mugged in broad daylight by a man armed only with a pen. Jay Gould walked away with the grand prize. He became the undisputed president of the Erie Railroad, the master of the Scarlet Woman. But the clinical verdict of history is incredibly grim. He won a ghost. By the time the ink dried on the settlement, the Erie had not just been watered down. It had been systematically eviscerated. The forensic evidence is permanently etched into the balance sheets from 1868 to 1872. Under Gould's stewardship, the railroad's debt ballooned from $16 million to a staggering $64 million. He treated the corporation as his personal financial engineering lab, a machine designed purely to generate liquidity for his next grift, while the physical iron and wood rotted into the earth. The Erie Railroad failed to pay a single dividend to its common stockholders for the next 60 years. 2 generations of investors waited for a return that Gould had already spent in a Jersey City hotel room before the decade was even over. The technology evolved, but the underlying trick never changed. In 1868, Jay Gould printed stock certificates in a damp, grease-stained basement. In 2026, corporations execute the exact same maneuver, with secondary offerings, aggressive stock-based compensation, and convertible venture debt. The printer is entirely digital now, but the dilution drains your purchasing power just the same. When you look at your retirement account and see a paper wealth that completely fails to offset the skyrocketing cost of living, you are staring directly at the ghost of Jay Gould. When a massive tech conglomerate announces a multi-billion-dollar stock buyback to pump its share price while laying off thousands of workers, they are reading directly from Gould's manual. When a bloated artificial intelligence startup inflates its valuation with complex debt instruments to lure in your pension fund, they are simply feeding the cattle salt and leading them to the water. The Erie War established a brutal moral hazard at the very heart of the American economy. The system does not punish the printer. It punishes the person holding the paper when the printing inevitably stops. Gould died one of the richest men on the planet, leaving behind a blueprint for systemic, refined thievery that Wall Street cleanly rebranded as market liquidity. Look at Gould's 1,868 playbook. He printed unlimited paper to buy his way out of debt, diluted the underlying value, and passed the check to the working class. Some critics argue the modern financial system still runs on this exact same dilution. Did Gould invent the modern economy, or did he just expose it as a legally sanctioned Ponzi scheme? Ask yourself that question the next time you look at a grocery receipt. In a casino where the house can infinitely print more chips the moment it starts losing, why are you still sitting at the table? Do you truly own the value of your labor? Or are you just holding a stack of wet ink, waiting for the next rowboat to slip across the Hudson, under the cover of fog? Because in the ledger of history, every debt must eventually be paid.